On a cold December morning in Essex, hidden behind the silence of rural fields, three notorious names, Pat Tate, Tony Tucker, Craig Rolfe, were found lifeless inside a Range Rover. Their deaths didn't just shock the underworld. They ignited a criminal saga that would grip the nation. Before the name Pat Tate was whispered in fear across the Essex underworld, before the Range Rover murders turned him into a legend of crime, he was just another boy from Southend. But from the very beginning, there was something different about him. Something darker. Something restless. Patrick Tate was born in 1958. Southend wasn't London, but it was close enough to feel its shadows. The seaside town was a strange mix. Families on holiday, arcades buzzing with coins, but also pubs filled with rough characters, petty crooks, and men who thrived on intimidation. For a young man like Pat, the lesson was simple. Respect wasn't given. It was taken. In his teenage years, Tate found an outlet for his aggression in bodybuilding. He became obsessed with size, with strength, with the idea of walking into a room and owning it. Essex gyms in the 1970s were breeding grounds, not just for athletes, but for enforcers, bouncers, debt collectors, men who knew that muscles could be currency. Tate thrived in that world. He loved the mirror, but more than that, he loved the fear his size created in others. But muscles weren't enough. Tate's real power came from his temper. He was unpredictable, explosive, and he made sure everyone knew it. One of the earliest incidents that defined his reputation took place in a Southend restaurant. The story goes that a simple disagreement, something as petty as slow service, was enough to light his fuse. Tate didn't just argue. He attacked. The waiter was left battered and broken. This wasn't a bar fight. It was a savage beating, a display of dominance. And it landed Tate exactly where many would expect: prison. For most men, prison was a warning, a chance to rethink. For Tate, it was a finishing school. Inside, he didn't just survive, he adapted. He learned. He watched how respect worked behind bars. It wasn't about words, it was about violence. It wasn't about charm, it was about intimidation. And Tate realized something important. He was built for this world. When he walked out of prison, Tate wasn't reformed. He was hardened, more dangerous, more convinced that the rules didn't apply to him. And soon, he found a new opportunity, a business that would change Essex forever. By the mid-1980s, Essex was changing. The rave scene was exploding. Warehouses filled with music, crowds moving to a new rhythm, and at the center of it all, ecstasy. The drug was everywhere. And it wasn't just a pill, it was a fortune. Dealers made thousands in a single night. And men like Pat Tate saw it not as a drug, but as an empire waiting to be built. Tate's entry into the drug world wasn't subtle. He wasn't the quiet, calculating type. He was the enforcer, the man you didn't cross. Stories began to spread. How Tate would beat men senseless over debts as small as a few £100s. How he'd walk into clubs, towering over the crowd, demanding respect with nothing more than his presence. And if respect wasn't given, violence followed. One thing became clear. Pat Tate wasn't just another dealer. He was unpredictable. He was terrifying. And in Essex's criminal underworld, fear was the most valuable currency of all. But trouble followed Tate wherever he went. In one period of his life, he fled to Spain, hoping to escape problems back home. Yet, even under the Spanish sun, Tate couldn't stay out of trouble. Violence clung to him like a shadow. Fights, disputes, debts. Wherever he went, chaos wasn't far behind. It wasn't geography that defined him. It was his nature. By now, Pat Tate had carved out a reputation. Not just as a dealer, not just as a bodybuilder, but as an enforcer. A man who could not be reasoned with, only feared. He believed he was untouchable. He believed nothing and no one could bring him down. And for a time, he was right. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a cultural explosion shook Britain. Young people gathered in fields, warehouses, and nightclubs, drawn to a new sound, a new freedom, and a new drug. Ecstasy wasn't just a pill. It was the heartbeat of a generation. And in Essex, three names would come to dominate that world: Tony Tucker, Craig Rolfe, and Pat Tate. At the center of this story was Tony Tucker, a charismatic figure with a sharp eye for business. Tucker ran nightclub security across Essex. But it wasn't just about keeping order. Controlling the doors meant controlling the flow of drugs inside. Every pill sold, every deal done, it all went through him. And soon, he needed muscle. Real muscle. That's where Pat Tate came in. Towering, brutal, and unpredictable, Tate was the perfect enforcer. If Tucker was the businessman, Tate was the hammer. The man who made sure debts were paid, who kept rivals silent, who reminded everyone why crossing the Essex Boys was a deadly mistake. Then there was Craig Rolfe, the youngest of the trio, less experienced, less feared. But Rolfe was loyal, and in this world, loyalty was worth more than gold. Together, the three men formed an alliance, each bringing something to the table. Tucker had the business, Rolfe had the loyalty, and Tate had the violence. By the early 1990s, the Essex Boys controlled vast swathes of the ecstasy trade. Tens of thousands of pounds flowed through their hands in a single night. Young ravers didn't know, or didn't care, who supplied their high. But behind the euphoria on the dance floor, the underworld was darker, more ruthless, more violent than most could imagine. Tate thrived in this chaos. He loved the power, the money, the respect. But most of all, he loved the fear. Stories circulated about his outbursts. How he'd smash pint glasses into men's faces. How he'd beat rivals with terrifying ferocity. Some said he could turn on a friend as quickly as an enemy. He was as much a liability as he was an asset. But Tucker knew, without Tate, their empire would crumble. Then, in 1995, tragedy struck. Leah Betts, an 18-year-old girl from Essex, collapsed after taking ecstasy at her birthday party. She died days later. The case made national headlines. For the first time, Britain saw the deadly side of the rave culture. And suddenly, all eyes were on the dealers supplying the drugs. The Essex Boys were caught in the storm. Tucker, who ran the clubs where ecstasy flowed like water, was painted as a villain. The media frenzy painted Tate and his crew as the dark face of the rave scene. Pressure mounted. The police ramped up operations, and paranoia began to spread through the Essex underworld. Inside the gang, tensions were rising. Tate's temper grew worse. He'd vanish for days, binging on drugs and alcohol, then return more violent than ever. Some allies began to fear him as much as they respected him. Arguments broke out. Deals went wrong. And yet, the money kept rolling in. The Essex Boys weren't just surviving, they were thriving. But power breeds enemies. Rival dealers resented the Essex Boys' control. Old debts resurfaced, and whispers began that someone was going to take them down. Tate dismissed it. He believed he was invincible. But in the criminal world, arrogance is often the first step toward destruction. Behind the flashing lights and the thundering music, a storm was gathering. A storm that would end not in profit, not in glory, but in blood. And for Pat Tate, the reckoning was closer than he realized. December 6th, 1995, a bitterly cold night in Essex. On a remote farm track near Rettendon, silence stretched across the fields. But inside one dark green Range Rover, three of the most feared men in Britain's criminal underworld sat unaware that within minutes they would be dead. Pat Tate, Tony Tucker, Craig Rolfe, the Essex Boys. For years, they had ruled the local drug scene with an iron fist. They believed they were untouchable. But that night, someone proved them wrong. Earlier that evening, Tate and his crew moved as they always did. Confident, loud. Tate, in particular, was in high spirits. He had dinner with friends, downing drinks, laughing as if the empire he'd built would last forever. But behind the bravado, cracks had begun to show. There were rumors of disputes over money. Drug shipments gone wrong, deals collapsing, enemies circling. And yet, Tate dismissed them all. He was convinced no one had the courage or the strength to touch him. He couldn't have been more wrong. That night, the three men climbed into their Range Rover. Rolfe behind the wheel, Tucker in the passenger seat, Tate in the back. They drove out toward Workhouse Lane, Rettendon. The reason? To meet men they believed were allies. A drug deal, perhaps. A settlement of accounts. The truth is still debated. But what's certain is this: they expected profit. What they got was death. At around 7 p.m., the Range Rover pulled onto the muddy track. The men inside had no idea what awaited them. Moments later, the silence of the countryside was shattered by the sound of gunfire. Whoever carried out the attack came prepared. Armed with shotguns, they executed the three men in cold blood. Rolfe slumped forward in the driver's seat, killed instantly. Tucker, too, was hit at close range. And Tate, the giant, the enforcer, the man who thought himself invincible, was blown apart in the back seat. There was no chance of survival. No chance to fight back. It was a massacre. In less than a minute, three of the most feared criminals in Essex were gone. The empire they built collapsed with the pull of a trigger. The next morning, December 7th, local farmers made a grisly discovery. The Range Rover sat cold and silent on the track, but the story didn't end on Workhouse Lane. Because when the bodies were found, the real battle began, the battle to uncover the truth. And what followed was an investigation mired in controversy, betrayal, and questions that remain unanswered even now. December 7th, 1995. The blood-soaked Range Rover had barely cooled before Essex police swarmed the lane. Three men lay dead: Pat Tate, Tony Tucker, Craig Rolfe, and the countryside was about to become the center of one of Britain's most infamous investigations. The sheer brutality of the killings sent shockwaves through Essex. To the press, it was the Range Rover murders. To detectives, it was a logistical nightmare. 3 executions. No witnesses. A crime scene in the middle of nowhere. And a long list of enemies who might have one of the Essex Boys dead. Within hours, Essex police launched Operation Century, a major task force dedicated to finding the killers. But they were starting with almost nothing. The killers left no fingerprints, no weapon, no tire tracks that could be traced. The Range Rover itself held only the bodies and chaos. But detectives knew one thing: Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe had made enemies everywhere. From rival dealers to disgruntled suppliers, suspects were everywhere. The task wasn't who wanted them dead. It was who had the means to do it. For months, the investigation went nowhere. Then came the break. A man named Darren Nichols, a low-level criminal. Nichols had links to the same networks as Tate and Tucker. More importantly, he was an associate of 2 men, Michael Steele and Jack Holmes. According to Nichols, Steele and Holmes weren't just dealers. They were the killers. And he claimed he knew because he was their driver that night. Nichols told police he had driven Steele and Holmes to Workhouse Lane. He waited nearby as they walked toward the Range Rover. Minutes later, he heard gunshots. When Steele and Holmes returned, he said they admitted they had killed the 3 men. Tate, Tucker, or Rolfe, executed in cold blood. For detectives, this was gold. Nichols wasn't just a witness. He was an insider. His testimony gave Operation Century the narrative they needed. But there was a problem. Nichols was also a criminal, a liar, a man desperate to save himself. Could they really trust him? Despite doubts, Essex police acted. In May 1996, Michael Steele and Jack Holmes were arrested and charged with the murders. Nichols entered witness protection, preparing to testify. The stage was set for one of the most sensational trials of the 1990s. The case drew massive attention. Newspapers painted Steele and Holmes as cold-blooded assassins. Nichols, meanwhile, was presented as the reluctant insider who had finally broken the code of silence. But beneath the headlines, things weren't so clear-cut. In January 1997, the trial began at the Old Bailey. The prosecution's case rested almost entirely on Darren Nichols. His testimony was graphic, detailed, and damning. He claimed Steele lured the Essex Boys to the lane with a promise of a lucrative drug deal. Holmes, he said, stood alongside him as they opened fire with shotguns. But the defense tore into Nichols. They branded him a liar, a career criminal making up stories to save his own skin. After all, he'd been granted immunity from prosecution for other crimes. He had everything to gain by pointing the finger. There was no forensic evidence linking Steele or Holmes to the murders. No DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon ever found. Just the word of one man. Despite the doubts, the jury delivered its verdict. Michael Steele, guilty. Jack Holmes, guilty. Both sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 25 years. For Essex police, it was a victory. For the families of Tate, Tucker, and Rolfe, it was closure. And for the public, it was the end of a terrifying chapter. The Essex Boys were dead, and their killers were behind bars. But the story didn't end in 1997. From the moment Steele and Holmes entered prison, doubts plagued the convictions. Critics argued the case was built on sand, on the unreliable word of a single informant. Appeals were filed. Campaigns were launched. Even to this day, many believe Steele and Holmes were framed and that the true killers walked free. In 2018, after serving 21 years, Jack Holmes was released on parole, having served his minimum sentence. Steele, however, remains in prison, still protesting his innocence. So who really killed the Essex Boys? Was it Steele and Holmes, as Nichols testified? Or was it a different crew entirely, professional hitmen or rivals who vanished back into the shadows? The truth remains uncertain. What's clear is that the Rettendon murders ended one empire and birthed a legend that still grips Britain's true crime world nearly 3 decades later. Who do you think really killed the Essex Boys? Let us know in the comments. Also, like, share, subscribe to the channel for more interesting stories.